In 1985, the mayor of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, went on Good Morning America and told 350,000 paying customers to go away. Not quietly, not through a memo to the city commission, not through some gradual shift in marketing strategy. On national television, to an audience of millions, Mayor Robert Dressler looked into the camera and announced that college students were no longer welcome in his city. That year, those students had spent an estimated $120 million in Fort Lauderdale over the course of 6 weeks. By the time the city was done enforcing its new policy, it had arrested over 2,500 of them in a single season. Within 3 years, the annual spring break crowd dropped from 350,000 to roughly 60,000. The bars that had built their entire business around the season went quiet. The mom-and-pop motels along the beach, the ones where kids crammed 10 to a room at $50 a night, started closing one by one. Fort Lauderdale had been the undisputed spring break capital of the United States for a quarter century. And then, in the space of a single television appearance, it decided it didn't want the title anymore. What makes this story unusual isn't that a city cracked down on bad behavior. Cities do that all the time. What makes it unusual is that Fort Lauderdale didn't stumble into becoming a spring break destination. It was made one, deliberately, by a chain of decisions going back decades. Decisions about a swimming pool, a novel, a Hollywood movie, and a drinking age. The city built an entire identity around the annual arrival of college students, rode it for 25 profitable years, and then chose to destroy it on live television. The question is whether that was the smartest thing Fort Lauderdale ever did or the most expensive mistake it ever made. The honest answer is that it might have been both. Fort Lauderdale barely existed before the 20th century. For most of its history, the area was swamp, river, and mosquitoes, a stretch of subtropical wilderness along a tidal waterway called the New River that no one particularly wanted to settle. The fort that gave the city its name was built in 1838 during the Second Seminole War and named after Major William Lauderdale, who commanded a company of Tennessee Mounted Volunteers. It was abandoned in 1842 after the war ended, and for the next 50 years the area was essentially deserted. In 1893, a 27-year-old man from Ohio named Frank Stranahan arrived to manage a ferry crossing and an overnight camp on the stagecoach route between Lake Worth and Coconut Grove. Stranahan was the kind of man that frontier towns depended on, part merchant, part postmaster, part civic institution unto himself. He opened a trading post on the New River where Seminole Indians would arrive by dugout canoe, sometimes camping for days at a time, trading pelts, plumes, and alligator hides for groceries and dry goods. Stranahan earned their trust through fair dealing, a quality rare enough on the frontier to be worth noting. He married the settlement's first school teacher, a young woman named Ivy Cromartie, who had come from Lemon City, what is now North Miami, in 1899 to teach 9 students for $48 a month. Between the two of them, the Stranahans became the closest thing the New River settlement had to a founding family. The railroad changed everything, as it always did in Florida. When Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railroad pushed through in 1896, connecting what had been an isolated outpost to the rest of the state, the settlement began its slow transformation into a town. Stranahan expanded into real estate and banking, financed the construction of the first road from the New River to Miami, and became one of the community's leading citizens. The city was incorporated in 1911 and named the county seat of the newly formed Broward County in 1915. At that point, Fort Lauderdale had roughly 2,000 residents. Then came the Florida land boom. During the 1920s, developers descended on South Florida with an ambition that bordered on delirium. In Fort Lauderdale, they began dredging canals and creating artificial islands from the muck and mangroves along the river and the intracoastal waterway. The process was almost absurdly literal. A dredge would suck mud from the bottom of a waterway and pile it up on either side, and the resulting mounds of muck would be shaped, compacted, and sold as waterfront real estate. The Finger Isles off Las Olas Boulevard, narrow strips of land jutting into the water, each lined with lots for homes that would have private docks and direct access to the intracoastal, were carved from nothing. A developer named C.J. Hector purchased land from the estate of Miami pioneer Mary Brickell and created the Rio Vista neighborhood, where by February 1923, the Fort Lauderdale Herald was reporting that development was booming, with over 5,000 feet of sidewalk laid and street lights installed. By 1925, the population had surged to 16,000. Hotels were going up. Yacht clubs were being planned. The stretch of intracoastal waterfront that would become known as Millionaire's Row was already attracting buyers who wanted to park their boats in their own backyards. The money was torrential, and the nickname Venice of America was being attached to the network of canals, eventually totaling 165 miles, that was transforming the landscape. The whole enterprise felt like the invention of a new kind of American city, one built on water instead of on land. And then, in a pattern that would repeat itself in Fort Lauderdale's history with almost mechanical precision, everything collapsed at once. The great Miami hurricane of September 18, 1926, roared across the coast and killed the land boom 3 years before the rest of the country caught up. The damage was staggering. Homes flattened, businesses destroyed. The perception that Florida was the paradise developers promised permanently dented. A second major hurricane struck in 1928, compounding the devastation. By 1929, the Depression had arrived nationwide, but Fort Lauderdale had already been in one for 3 years. Frank Stranahan, the founding father, was ruined. His bank had closed. His considerable land holdings were mortgaged to the hilt. His health, both physical and mental, was failing. In April of 1929, he wrote in his diary, "My wife gave me much encouragement, but I can't seem to grasp it." In May, he suffered a nervous breakdown and spent 10 days in the hospital. When he was released, doctors advised Ivy not to leave him alone. But on May 22, 1929, after the couple returned from an excursion, Ivy stepped inside the house for just a few minutes. That was long enough. Frank tied a sewer grate to his waist and threw himself into the New River, the same river where he had operated his ferry 36 years earlier. He was 63 years old. Ivy Stranahan refused to accept the official finding. She scored the word suicide out of every newspaper clipping she kept about her husband's death. Devastated, she went into mourning for a decade. The Stranahan house, which had been worth $600,000 at the height of the boom, was now valued at $50,000. Ivy made ends meet by renting out rooms and leasing the ground floor to a series of restaurants, though, as a committed teetotaler, she refused to let any of them serve alcohol. She lived in that house until her death in 1971 at the age of 90, and the building remains the oldest surviving structure in Broward County today. But the city that Frank Stranahan founded would find its identity not in its pioneer origins, not in its canals, not in its land boom, but in something no one could have predicted: a swimming pool. In January 1928, the same year the second hurricane struck, Fort Lauderdale had dedicated the casino pool. It was a magnificent facility, built right on the beach just south of Las Olas Boulevard, engineered by Clifford Root, filled twice a week with salt water pumped directly from the Atlantic Ocean. It cost $150,000 to build and measured over 50 meters long, making it the first Olympic-sized swimming pool in the state of Florida. The architecture was Spanish colonial, and the pool quickly became home to the nation's top competitive swimmers. Catherine Rawls, Fort Lauderdale's first celebrity athlete, trained there and went on to capture an astonishing 30 national titles in swimming and diving, make the 1932 and 1936 Olympic teams, and earn the Associated Press's designation as the National Female Athlete of the Year in 1936. The casino pool put Fort Lauderdale on the map of competitive aquatics, and that connection, seemingly so minor, is what brought the college kids. In 1935, a Colgate University swimming coach named Sam Ingram was invited to bring his team down from the frozen campus in upstate New York to train during the winter break. Fort Lauderdale was, at that point, still a tiny southern town struggling to recover from the Depression. But it had the one thing no other small town in America had: a pool large enough for collegiate events. Ingram came. His swimmers loved the warm weather. The following year, the event drew over 100 participants, and a tradition was born: the College Coaches Swim Forum. By 1938, it was attracting more than 300 swimmers from schools across the country. A few years later, the Women's National Aquatic Forum joined the event. Over the decades, the forum would grow to involve 44 colleges and universities, 28 prep schools, 28 clubs, and over 600 swimmers arriving each winter for training. And once the swimmers came, their friends came too. The friends were not there for the backstroke. They were there because Fort Lauderdale in March was 80 degrees and sunny, and wherever they had come from, Michigan, Ohio, Connecticut, New York, it was 40 degrees and raining. The swimming teams were the excuse. The weather was the reason. And the bars along the beach were happy to serve anyone who walked through the door. During World War II, a different population discovered the same appeal. Wealthy Ivy Leaguers who had traditionally spent their breaks in the Caribbean found themselves rethinking the trip. Rumors of German submarine activity in the waters between Florida and the islands made the yacht clubs of Nassau and Bermuda seem less appealing. They came to Fort Lauderdale instead and discovered that the one body of water guaranteed to be free of German torpedoes was an enormous glass of cheap American beer. Meanwhile, in 1942, Fort Lauderdale became home to a naval air station that trained pilots, radar operators, and fire control operators. A Coast Guard base was established at Port Everglades. Thousands of young men from across the country spent months training in Fort Lauderdale's warm weather, swimming in its ocean, drinking in its bars. And they remembered it. The most famous event associated with the base occurred on December 5, 1945, 4 months after the war ended. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from the Naval Air Station on a routine navigational training flight. Flight 19, as it was designated, vanished somewhere over the Atlantic. All 5 planes, all 14 men. A rescue plane sent to find them disappeared as well, with 13 more crew. 27 men, 6 aircraft, no wreckage ever found. The incident became the founding legend of the Bermuda Triangle. But the more consequential legacy of the Naval Air Station was less mysterious. When the war ended, thousands of veterans remembered Fort Lauderdale as a place where the sun shone and the beer was cold. They came back, and they brought their families. The population exploded with a force that made the 1920s boom look modest. The 1950 census counted roughly 36,000 people in Fort Lauderdale. By 1960, it was 83,648, a 230% increase in a single decade. Neighborhoods spread westward from the coast in concentric rings of new subdivision. The canal system expanded as developers dredged more finger islands for waterfront homes, and the Venice of America nickname started appearing in real estate advertisements nationwide. A 1967 city report would estimate that Fort Lauderdale was approximately 85% built out, the entire landscape from swamp to suburb filled in within a single generation. Along the beach, a strip of small motels appeared almost overnight in the late 1940s and through the 1950s. These were not grand hotels. They were modest 2-story affairs: cinder block, pastel paint, a neon sign shaped like a palm tree or a seahorse, a courtyard pool, and a parking lot. The Sand Castle Resort, the Blue Marlin, the Outrigger, the Castle by the Sea, the Jolly Roger, which opened in 1951 with a full pirate theme, the Sunrise Inn, with its towel racks crowded with the gear of college swimmers, the Oceanfront Cavalier, which could boast a pitch and putt golf course, shuffleboard courts, and air conditioning. Looking at those buildings in their prime, with their clean lines and their copper-tone ad optimism, was like looking at a postcard from an America that was just learning how to take a vacation. These places would shape the destiny of the city more than any canal or any yacht club ever did. During those same post-war years, the trickle of college students that had begun with the swimming teams was growing into something much larger. By the mid-1950s, more than 15,000 students were showing up in Fort Lauderdale every spring. The beaches were wide and free. The motels along A1A were cheap. And there was one detail about Florida law that mattered more than any advertising campaign: the drinking age. Florida's drinking age had been 21 after Prohibition, but it was lowered to 18 in 1973, following the passage of the 26th Amendment that dropped the voting age to 18 nationwide. The logic was straightforward. If you could vote and be drafted, you could buy a beer. For Fort Lauderdale, the timing was perfect. It meant that the vast majority of college students arriving for spring break could drink legally the moment they hit the beach. Every bar on the Strip could serve them without checking an ID twice. Every motel that stocked a case of Budweiser in the lobby cooler could sell it to anyone old enough to be a sophomore. This single fact, legal alcohol at 18 in a state with beaches, was the invisible infrastructure of the entire spring break economy. It mattered more than the weather. It mattered more than the movie. It was the engine beneath the engine. And at the corner of Las Olas Boulevard and A1A, there was a bar that had been waiting for this moment since before anyone knew it was coming. The Elbo Room had opened in 1938, the same year as the first swim forum. It was nothing special architecturally, a concrete block building rebuilt after a fire in 1956, with an upstairs deck and a view of the ocean. But its location was everything. It sat at the exact point where the city's main commercial boulevard met the beach. If you were a college student in Fort Lauderdale in March, you ended up at the Elbo Room the way water ends up at the lowest point in a landscape. It was gravitational. And it was about to become one of the most famous bars in America. In the late 1950s, a Michigan State University English professor named Glendon Swarthout overheard his honor students talking about an upcoming spring break trip to Fort Lauderdale. Intrigued, he asked if he could come along. They invited him. What he observed during 2 weeks of what he generously called research became the basis of a novel. In a 1985 interview with Larry King, Swarthout said, "It occurred to me as the week progressed that this would make a fine novel, a very funny novel, and yet, I thought at the same time, write a kind of profile of that particular generation, their aspirations, their hopes, their fears." The title came from a 1959 Time magazine article in which a young co-ed was asked why she traveled to Fort Lauderdale every spring. Her answer was 4 words: "That's where the boys are." Swarthout's novel was published in 1960 and became a bestseller. MGM purchased the film rights and rushed the production. The budget was $1.4 million. The cast included Connie Francis, George Hamilton, Dolores Hart, Yvette Mimieux, and Paula Prentice. MGM sent the cast on a 6-week publicity tour of television, radio, and newspaper interviews across the country. Where the Boys Are premiered at the Gateway Cinema on Sunrise Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale on December 28, 1960. And it depicted spring break as a harmless, sun-drenched ritual of flirtation and mild rebellion. Wholesome enough for parents to tolerate, exciting enough for their daughters to want to try. Scenes were filmed on the beach, along A1A, and inside the Elbo Room. The title song, sung by Connie Francis, became a #1 hit. The film grossed more than 3 times its budget at the box office. The effect on Fort Lauderdale was like a bomb going off, except the explosion was made of people. Before the movie, the city had been absorbing around 20,000 spring break visitors a year, a manageable number for a growing beach community. The very first spring after the film's release in March 1961, roughly 50,000 showed up. The city was staggered. A photograph from that week shows a student who had climbed the light pole directly in front of the Elbo Room, dangling above the surging crowd like a flag of conquest. Nearly 400 students were arrested in 2 days as crowds massed along the strip. And the money. The money was extraordinary. Every motel room within miles of the beach was booked solid. Every bar was packed past legal capacity. Every restaurant had a line out the door. The small business owners along A1A, the ones who'd been scraping through spring with empty rooms and quiet cash registers, were suddenly overwhelmed with customers. Fort Lauderdale had found its economic engine, and it wasn't canals or yachts or winter vegetables or the trade in Seminole pelts. It was spring break, and the engine had a name, a movie, and a #1 hit song. What happened next was 25 years of escalation so steady it felt almost geological. In the early 1960s, the numbers kept climbing. 50,000 became 75,000, became 100,000. The students came from the Midwest, the Northeast, the South, piling into cars and driving south on I-95 with beer in the trunk and a copy of Where the Boys Are in their collective imagination. Each year's class told the next year's class. The Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce didn't spend a single dollar on advertising to attract them. As one official marveled in a 1985 interview, "We've never spent one dime on advertising. It just happens. They just come year after year. It's a phenomenon." The city was printing money from a marketing campaign it never ran for a product it never designed. The swimming pool brought the swimmers. The swimmers brought the students. The students brought a professor. The professor wrote a novel. The novel became a movie, and the movie became an economy. For a quarter century, Fort Lauderdale was the unquestioned spring break capital of the United States. The numbers grew every year, and the culture evolved, or devolved, depending on your perspective. In the 1960s, it was still relatively tame. Sunburned kids drinking beer on the beach, flirting, getting minor sunstroke. By the 1970s, the drinking age had dropped to 18, and things got looser. By the early 1980s, MTV had arrived, and the network began broadcasting spring break specials that showed the whole country what was happening on Fort Lauderdale Beach, which was, increasingly, something closer to organized chaos. Wet T-shirt contests, all-you-can-drink specials at bars that had no incentive to cut anyone off. Events at places like The Button, a bar on the Strip that featured competitions too lewd to describe on camera. A 1983 film simply called Spring Break was shot in Fort Lauderdale and reflected the escalation. Less romance, more raw excess. The nickname Fort Liquordale stuck because it was accurate. The economics of the arrangement were brutally simple. The students spent money, and that money supported an ecosystem of small businesses that might otherwise have struggled through the spring shoulder season. The motels in particular depended on it. These were independently owned places, many built in the 1950s, with names like the Sandcastle Resort, the Blue Marlin, the Outrigger, the Castle by the Sea, the Jolly Roger. They were two-story concrete block buildings with parking lots and swimming pools, charging rates that haven't existed on a Florida beachfront in decades. The students would jam 10 people into a room designed for 4, splitting the cost to almost nothing per head. The motel owners knew it was happening. The alternative was empty rooms. But the arrangement had a cost, and by the early 1980s, that cost was becoming impossible to ignore. The students weren't just drinking. They were destroying hotel rooms, ripping fixtures off walls, breaking furniture, flooding bathrooms. They were defecating on the public beach. They were engaging in balcony diving, a drunk game where participants tried to swing from one hotel balcony to the next, or jumped from upper floors into the pool below. People died. Students who had been drinking all day passed out on the beach and choked. The traffic on A1A ground to a halt every night for weeks. Permanent residents who lived anywhere near the beach couldn't sleep, couldn't park, couldn't walk to the corner without stepping over someone. The city's national reputation, which had once been carefree and vaguely glamorous, was now something closer to a public health emergency. Everything came to a head in 1985. An estimated 350,000 college students descended on Fort Lauderdale during a 6-week window. They spent $120 million. They represented, for a city of roughly 153,000 permanent residents, a seasonal invasion that more than doubled the population. The problems were no longer anecdotal. They were systemic. Traffic paralysis, public intoxication on an industrial scale, property destruction, sexual assault, and death. Robert Dressler had been elected mayor in 1982, the first directly elected mayor in the city's history. He was a Republican, a lawyer, a man who looked at the beachfront and saw not a party, but an investment being systematically destroyed. He later described the Strip to a reporter in blunt terms. The people who want to come now are the party crowds, the druggies, the hookers, and the teeny boppers. And then he added the sentence that explained everything. One of the most important reasons we need to redevelop and revitalize our beach is to get away from the apparent addiction to spring break. If we were talking about some area of the city that is on the periphery, it might not be such a big deal. But we are talking about the major focal point of the city, and our focal point and image has to be different than a drunken party for 2 months. So in 1985, Dressler went on Good Morning America. He appeared alongside the mayor of Daytona Beach. He told the country that Fort Lauderdale no longer wanted their spring break business. He suggested, with a politeness that was somehow more devastating than a rejection, that students might consider visiting Daytona Beach instead, that fair city up the coast that was happy to have them. It was a sitting mayor on national television telling a customer base worth $120 million a year to take their money to a direct competitor. The city backed up the words with action. In late 1985, the Commission passed ordinances banning open alcohol containers on the beach side of A1A. Overnight parking on the beach was prohibited. In March 1986, the city installed chain-link fences and barriers to control pedestrian and vehicle traffic along the Strip. MTV was asked not to set up its broadcast equipment on the beach. Police were given zero-tolerance enforcement orders. Over 2,500 arrests during that spring break season. The following year, arrests nearly tripled from pre-crackdown levels. The students heard the message. They heard it because it was delivered on national television, and because the alternative, getting arrested in Fort Lauderdale, was considerably less fun than getting drunk in Daytona Beach. The spring break crowds dropped sharply, from 350,000 in 1985 to roughly 60,000 by 1988. MTV moved its spring break broadcast to Daytona Beach, which eagerly accepted the publicity and the money. Meanwhile, another blow was landing simultaneously. Florida raised its drinking age from 18 to 21, completing the change by 1987 to comply with the National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984, which threatened to withhold federal highway funding from states that didn't raise their limit. The combination was devastating. The youngest students, freshmen and sophomores, the core of the party crowd, couldn't drink legally anymore. Many headed to Cancun, where the drinking age was 18 and the peso bought a lot of tequila. Others scattered to Panama City Beach, South Padre Island, or wherever they heard the party had moved. The aftermath was precisely what anyone who has ever run a small business would have predicted. Bar owners along the Strip watched their revenues evaporate in real time. Restaurant operators who had counted on 6 weeks of guaranteed traffic found themselves serving empty rooms. Retail shops that had stocked up on sunglasses, bikinis, and souvenir T-shirts were stuck with inventory. The economic pain was not abstract. These were families. A woman who had been running a motel on the beach since 1962 didn't have a backup plan. A bartender who had worked the spring break rush for 15 years didn't have a resume that translated to the kind of establishment that was coming next. A report from the early 1990s estimated that Fort Lauderdale had lost over $175 million in annual spring break spending, a staggering figure for a beachfront community, and a sum from which the small business ecosystem would never recover. The mom-and-pop motels, those two-story concrete block monuments to post-war Florida optimism, began disappearing one by one. The Sandcastle Resort, the Blue Marlin, the Outrigger, the Castle by the Sea, gone. The Sweden House Smorgasbord, with its promise of fine food and gracious dining, shuttered. Some owners went bankrupt outright. Others sold to developers who saw the beachfront not as a place to house spring breakers at $50 a night, but as some of the most undervalued oceanfront real estate in the southeastern United States. By the mid-1990s, nearly every block of A1A that had once held a budget motel was either under construction or marked for demolition. And here is where the story becomes complicated, because the developers were not wrong. Fort Lauderdale's beachfront was objectively a spectacularly undervalued asset. Oceanfront property in a major metropolitan area, warm weather year-round, an international airport, a deep-water cruise port at Port Everglades. The spring break economy had been a low-margin, high-chaos way of extracting value from that asset. The developers saw the high-margin, low-chaos alternative. Through the 1990s, the transformation was gradual. The city began actively marketing Fort Lauderdale as a destination for families, international travelers, and the growing LGBTQ tourism market. The beachfront promenade was redesigned in 1988 with a distinctive wave wall that gave the Strip a more sophisticated character. But the fundamental shift came in the early 2000s when the luxury hotel chains arrived in force. The Ritz-Carlton Fort Lauderdale opened on the beach in 2007, replacing the kind of budget lodging where spring breakers had once crammed 10 to a room. The W Fort Lauderdale Hotel and Residences opened in 2009, a $220 million boutique hotel and condominium project designed as the opposite of everything the Strip had been. The Four Seasons, the Conrad, the Westin, the Hilton, they all built properties along the same stretch of A1A that had once been wall-to-wall mom-and-pop motels. Some of these new hotels wouldn't rent to anyone under 25. The nightly rate was no longer $50 split 10 ways. It was $400, $500, $600 a night for a room that slept two. The old motels vanished so completely that a visitor arriving in Fort Lauderdale today would have no idea they had ever existed. The Jolly Roger, with its pirate-themed decor dating from 1951, was barely recognizable after several renovations. The Sweden House Smorgasbord, which had once advertised fine food and gracious dining to a clientele composed largely of sunburned 20-year-olds, was a memory. The neighborhood called North Beach Village, which had been built almost entirely from small post-war motels and garden apartments, was systematically demolished and replaced with high-rise condominiums. By 2006, the annual spring break crowd had dwindled to roughly 10,000 students, less than 3% of the 1985 peak. A visitor walking the Strip who had last been there in 1984 would not have recognized a single building. The beachfront skyline was glass and steel, the kind of architecture that could be in Miami or Dubai or anywhere money goes to look at the ocean. The yachting industry, built around those 165 miles of canals that the 1920s developers had dug from the mangroves, was generating more than 109,000 jobs in Broward County. The annual Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show, one of the 3 largest in the world, brought over 125,000 visitors each year. People who spent money on a scale that made the spring break crowds look like pocket change. Port Everglades was handling millions of cruise passengers annually. The city's economy had diversified into technology, finance, insurance, real estate, marine manufacturing, and the boating industry alone was supporting 42,000 registered vessels and roughly 100 marinas and boatyards. Fort Lauderdale's population, which had actually shrunk between 1980 and 1990 from 153,279 to 149,377, a decline that coincided almost exactly with the spring break exodus, was climbing again past 180,000 as downtown redevelopment drew new residents. By any standard economic measure, Fort Lauderdale is a wealthier, more stable, more diversified city than it was in 1985. And it's worth noting what happened to the cities that took Fort Lauderdale's cast-off spring break traffic. Daytona Beach, which had eagerly welcomed the crowds with advertising budgets and MTV cameras, went through its own crisis by the late 1990s. The same problems, the same pattern. Students falling off hotel balconies, vandalism, mass arrests. By the early 2000s, Daytona cracked down too, and the party migrated to Panama City Beach on the Florida Panhandle. Panama City Beach welcomed it, rode the money, endured the chaos, and eventually passed its own restrictions. The spring break economy is a kind of traveling circus that no city has ever figured out how to keep without eventually paying a price that exceeds the revenue. The casino pool, the beautiful saltwater facility where it all began, was demolished in the mid-1960s after nearly 4 decades of service. In its place, roughly 100 yards away, the International Swimming Hall of Fame was built. The aquatic complex completed in 1965 for $986,000. The museum dedicated in 1968 for $295,000. The pool that had drawn Sam Ingram's Colgate swimmers in 1935, the pool that had started the chain reaction leading to 350,000 spring breakers and $120 million, and a mayor on national television telling an entire generation of college students to get lost. That pool is gone. Sam Ingram probably never imagined what his winter training trip would set in motion. Glendon Swarthout, the English professor who tagged along with his students and turned their spring break into a best-selling novel and a hit movie, died in 1992 in Arizona, far from the beach he had made famous. The Gateway Cinema on Sunrise Boulevard, where the Boys Are premiered on December 28, 1960, is gone. Connie Francis, who sang the title song and starred in the film, turned up at the Elbo Room for its 80th anniversary celebration in 2018, signing autographs for fans who remembered the version of Fort Lauderdale that her movie had invented. Robert Dressler, the mayor who killed spring break, died in June 2024 at the age of 78. His daughter said he loved the city and wanted to make it better for residents. She also noted, with something that sounded like old frustration, that her father had done the hard work of ending spring break, but the mayor who came after him, Bob Cox, who took office in 1986, often got the credit. Dressler resigned from office that same year to run for the Florida Senate. The decision he had made was already irreversible. At the corner of Las Olas Boulevard and A1A, the Elbo Room's neon sign still glows above the sidewalk. The building is the same low-slung concrete block it has been since 1956, hemmed in now by luxury towers and upscale restaurants. The ocean is right there, the same ocean that filled the casino pool twice a week, the same ocean that swallowed Flight 19. A band is playing upstairs. A few tourists sit on the patio with drinks. The room is loud, but not 350,000 people loud. Not anymore. It is a bar that has been famous for nearly 90 years, and it doesn't look like much, just concrete and neon holding its ground at the exact spot where Fort Lauderdale became Fort Lauderdale, and then decided to become something else entirely.